Okay, call to order this meeting of the Eastern Reading Region 9 Joint Boards of Education Policy Committee at 9:10 a.m. on March 19th, 2021. Committee members present: Gwen Denny, Christopher Parkin, John Stinson. Not present: Maureen Williams. No members of the public present. I actually haven't had a chance to review the minutes yet, and I would hope that we can move that to next week to review the minutes if that works for everyone. I don't know if anybody else got a chance to review them either, but I want to take a look at those first. We have no members of the public being present, so that takes us to committee member comment. Nope. Okay. Which moves us to discussion and possible action. 5A, so the CABE model policy review. Last week we started looking at a sort of set of policies that we traditionally haven't looked at, which is the sort of the bylaw policies. And we don't look at those because generally we think of each board's responsibility to sort of set its own bylaws as sort of distinct from this larger exercise to come together around sort of a basic set of policies. That said, we have felt it necessary to sort of start the process of discussing the basic mechanics and processes that we want to use related to sort of dispute resolution and sort of any time that we have multiple boards together, how we're going to work and just sort of setting the standards for that. So we made some really nice progress last week on drafting some ideas for that. The point of this exercise will be that we continue to work on those ideas and then move to, I think we have an evening meeting scheduled of the policy committee, which we're trying to schedule so that as many board members as possible and members of the public can attend, and we can discuss the sort of the ideas that we come up with in that larger venue.
That's early April, I think, John.
I think that's right. It should be coming up in 2 or 3 weeks. I think we were just trying to wait until we got through some of the sort of the meatier parts of the budget process, and then
I note that it's April 8th, and I just reviewed that because one thing that's coming up on the horizon that I think all boards and committees need to be aware of is that the executive orders are set to expire on April 19th. One of those executive orders provides the rules around these purely electronic meetings, and absent any further action of legislature or the governor, a purely electronic meeting will be arguably unlawful on April 20th. And so we'll have to adjust our practices at that point, absent a change in regulation.
Our practices of getting dressed before meetings.
Well,
all the way dressed.
Not wearing sweatpants with
I didn't say that.
the button-up shirt.
Real pants.
So, but and the remedy for that can be, because it's always been allowed to do sort of meet via teleconference. The remedy for that may be to simply have a place where the public could convene, right? But we don't have to be there.
It's a complicated issue because the statute is arcane, and the statute was not drafted with this in mind at all.
It says telephonic, right?
And
you can join by electronic means is one of the terms that's in the statute. And so this was actually an issue this week because there's several bills in the legislature to cure this.
Yeah.
And the FOI Commission, when I've talked to them, has taken the position that you need a physical location if you're going to dial into a meeting. And so in theory, we could do this as long as we posted the location as central office, and members of the public could attend at central office and witness the meeting from central or whatever physical location.
It could be anywhere. It could be the community room in the Easton Library or a room at the Mark Twain Library, as long as there's a phone that is dialed in to that room.
Right. And then you get into additional complication. If a member of the committee is present and hosting that, then it's become a hybrid meeting under 9H, and you need to consult with the health department as to how many people can be there.
Right.
And there's a spiral of complications, but I guess 9H would expire too.
Right.
So there's a spiral of complications as to what that all looks like.
But there's probably not appetite on the part of the sort of members here to go sort of be there in person and the sort of the hybrid, all that stuff.
No, I think we need to do I think we just need to be cognizant of the fact that we need to adjust to sort of the letter of the FOI law. And in my research on this, because I'm concerned about the executive orders expiring, I know CABE takes the view that this has always been permissible and we don't need a
Right.
physical location.
Right.
I, I tend to be more conservative in the approach of relying on FOI commissions
Right.
view, because they'd ultimately be the one adjudicating a complaint about
Right.
this.
Right. Yeah. And who needs the headache if all you had to do was make sure that there was a place that the public could have dialed in from?
Right. But the governor has a bill to address this. The GAE committee has a bill to address this. And so there's discussion underway, but it probably won't be remedied by the time the orders expire in April.
Okay. Cool. Thank you. Thanks for that info. Okay. So looking at the progress we had made last time, we were working, and bear with me just one moment. I'm gonna actually tri-board policy work. Very good. All right. Okay, so this is where we left off. We sort of, in quick summary, we had talked about essentially trying to create two large categories. When we're talking about action that the board is taking, there are the sort of procedural actions, and then there are the substantive actions. And we talked about saying, there may be a lower threshold for resolving conflict that could be a simple majority of the voting members present, whereas a more substantive issue may require a supermajority, which I think we decided was 75% of all members present and voting. And we started to go through the process of articulating each one of the sort of types of things that would fall under procedural versus substantive. And we talked about the possibility of, if in the midst of a procedural, an otherwise sort of determined procedural process, someone disputes that this is in fact substantive, that alone could be the action that kicks it over and requires the sort of greater scrutiny. We also talked about the possibility of assigning a parliamentarian that would help. I think one of the options that was discussed, and I think Chris, you suggested having a parliamentarian that was maybe the secretary of the whoever was the current chair,
presiding board,
exactly. Which I think that could work. The one concern I have is secretaries aren't necessarily as well versed in parliamentary procedures as any other member. So it may be something that we start any meeting with, here's the person who is the chair and who is the person who's going to be the parliamentarian. Maybe that's
and there might be an argument to say that this question of who is the decider on parliamentary issues becomes sort of a small p political issue, in as much as it's because they're from this board, they're always going to side with whatever,
right?
And that might give some credence to the idea, not to create administrative burden, but to say, if we have the luxury right now of a director of finance and operations with a legal background, who maybe is well suited to parliamentary issues, and you can appoint Mr. Zachary as the parliamentarian to settle these things on a more objective basis that is not in the weeds of kind of the political trenches that emerge in these situations sometimes.
All right, so it sounds like we've talked about at least three options here: secretary of the presiding board, a sort of
member of administration, or designated non-board member. I mean, I know in my private practice, I've dealt with boards of education who have retained, independent counsel to be parliamentarians in sticky situations. I don't want to be in the business of bringing a lawyer to our tri-board meetings and paying them for the purpose of handling parliamentary issues. But just in the context of having a third party be the person who's helping with that is not the worst thing.
the idea that I'm floating here, I mean, maybe it's DOA, but if at the beginning of the meeting you're electing a parliamentarian from amongst the various boards, and that, you know, that could go based on a simple majority or a supermajority, whatever. What I like about that is it establishes at the beginning, and even if we use the secretary of the presiding board or a designated non-board member, whatever, sort of whatever scheme we come up with, I think it actually probably is important that at the beginning of the meeting, we state, you know, here's the person presiding as chair of this meeting. Here's the person who will serve the role as parliamentarian, to remind everyone at times we disagree on process. Here is the person who's going to help us to find our way.
Right. Because I could see an hour-long discussion arguing who the parliamentarian is in the middle of a meeting.
Yeah, that's not a bad point. So probably not an in-meeting elected parliamentarian, but we'll keep the options so that we can discuss this. And
I mean, it breeds a sub-question, which is whether or not it is good practice for the three boards to have as a standing part of their bylaws the expectation that they name a parliamentarian. And to the extent that you're electing officers every 2 years, do you also want to be naming the person who is ultimately charged with understanding the bylaws and the rules of procedure?
Right.
So that there is sort of that adjudicative role. And then that person would sort of fall into this responsibility automatically.
Yeah, I've just become the de facto parliamentarian for my board.
Right.
And, you know, I'm not really sure. I'm looking around going, should that be the case? And fine. But yeah, I really like the idea. And especially if we actually built out some sort of roles and responsibility language around that and developed a training program around that. And I know that all sounds like, oh, that's a lot of work that you're doing. It's not. It's, you know, here is a YouTube video and a PDF to read, and, you know, that'll make you a lot smarter.
I felt like the boards are always precariously close to sort of falling off the cliff into a Robert's Rules argument amongst lots of people who are superficially familiar with Robert's Rules, but not in a sort of real working sense, because the boards have never really operated in a pure parliamentarian fashion. There's been a high degree of informality, which has generally been fine for the work that we're doing. But when things get tense, then people start calling for, subsidiary motions to motions and things like that. And you lose 18 out of 21 people once you start playing parliamentary games, basically. Having everybody on an even footing is best for the overall functioning of the organization.
Yeah. You also lose the public, right? It's you start getting to that stuff. It's just like, why can't we just talk about this? It's like, okay, okay. All right. So I think we've put together a set of options for, what the mechanism is and sort of how that actually works. I know, Chris, I think you and maybe a member of your board have done pretty significant research on the way that has been used in the past. I feel like that sort of presentation of that research would be important to discussing these issues so that we have the facts on the table, because I think going into this conversation, there may be some members of the various boards or the public who will say, this is not really an issue because it's never been used. This is not really an issue because it's been used consistently. But I think your research has proven that it has not been used consistently.
Right. The precedent is that there are all measure of ways in which the concept that 2/3 of the board can compel the third board to come along has been used procedurally, substantively, budgetarily, non-budgetarily.
Right.
And that has led to a position where any member of any one board can point to a precedent about anything and say, that's the way we've always done it.
Right.
And obviously, intermittently, there have also been times where the boards haven't agreed, but the mechanism hasn't been invoked.
Yeah.
And the minutes aren't going to tell you exactly why that was.
Right.
As recently as the past 12 months, there have been times where 2 out of the 3 boards agreed or didn't agree,
right.
but it wasn't pressed for second and third votes. So it was let to sit.
Right. And I specifically have been really against sort of invoking the mechanism. Like I've had no appetite for that.
But I mean, that begs another question. When you say invoking the mechanism,
right?
When 2 out of 3 vote one way, do you automatically do it again? Or does there have to be a motion to invoke the mechanism to say, I really want to push this?
Yeah, that's good.
Right. Well, and practically speaking, if you are in a situation where, one board really is opposed to an idea, or, whatever the thing is, if we're, I don't know. I mean, I guess it kind of depends on the thing. If it's a budget, that I guess you suck it up and you accept the budget. If it's a personnel issue,
Mhm.
how's that going to go? If, one board be forced to hire a person they don't want to hire? And
Right.
how would that be, practically speaking, for that employee? I wouldn't want to be that employee.
Right.
And then, are you then in a situation where that board just adjourns their meeting and walks out?
Right.
And then are they obligated to fund that position? So this is what I keep every time I think about this when I'm driving. Usually, it becomes a big circle in my head, and
Mhm.
it's like there's no good way to, because
And that sort of drives an overlapping conversation with sort of the negotiating committee's charge of, when you say a personnel issue,
Right.
what jobs are the boards
Right.
ultimately responsible for hiring
Right.
and have that sort of veto authority over? And how broad is that authority? Because there's a difference between the three boards saying, two out of the three boards are compelling the creation of, the director of, fun and games, and the third board has to deal with the fact that we now have a director of fun and games, versus we want to appoint Tom Jones the director of fun and games, and one board objects to that.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, and Gwen, I think it's a really good point too. In the various sort of ideas of how this could work, we've got the 2 out of 3 boards. We've got the 75% of all members present. One more than half of members present. I think it's sort of probably the easiest to get to is the simple majority. The next hardest to get to is the 2 out of 3, and then the hardest to achieve would be 75% of all members present. There could be situations where that's not the case, but I think it would tend to work out that way. I would favor the hardest version of that. If there's any mechanism at all, and then, the other one is there is no mechanism. All three have to come to agreement to do anything jointly. If we do agree on some kind of mechanism for getting there, well, then what does that look like? In terms of when we invoke that, even if we have 75%, I would still be particularly cautious about supporting an action that's compelling, another board.
I think it's totally reasonable to default to option 4 when it comes to appointing a particular individual to a particular job, because like Gwen said, I wouldn't want to be the candidate who is coming into a job where a third of my employer kind of said, I don't really like you.
Right.
Like that wouldn't set anybody up for success. But I do think that in those circumstances, the overwhelming majority of the time, the hire is being born out of a search process that is being conducted collaboratively across the three boards anyway, with the goal of a public-facing unanimity that inspires a level of confidence in the process.
Yeah. Are we creating a new category? Procedural, substantive, and super substantive?
I mean, you could say, I don't even know if you want to say super substantive. I think you might want to just say appointment of senior personnel.
Right.
Which is its own, which is different than creating a role, which is sort of a sub-budgetary issue.
Yeah, true. I do wonder about, other things that could fall into that bucket. Some kind of major capital expenditure, like moving central office, right? Something like that could be.
I don't know. That's a lease that we enter into right now. I don't think, and the three boards acting collaboratively don't really have any capital authority, which is its own
the central office budget.
Weird piece.
No
like,
you're right, but
I mean, if in theory the three boards wanted to acquire property and build a central office, they don't have the authority to do that because Easton and Reading can't bond, or carry debt. They need to go to the towns to ask for that. And I don't know how you trifurcate a bond issue across three financing authorities.
And, yeah, Region 9 could do it independently and then charge rent or something.
Right, that's what would have to
Would have to
happen.
probably-
Either one of the towns or the region would have to take charge of the project and rent it back to the others on a left pocket, right pocket basis.
Yeah.
Are we saying appointment of senior personnel, that's a process exempt?
I mean, you could just say, we'll always default to option 4. We'll always require a vote of all 3 boards or approval of all 3 boards.
How are you defining senior personnel? Because that, I mean, it will be the next question. Are you
yeah.
talking about only central office administrators? Are you talking about principals?
I'm thinking well, it couldn't be principals because those are each employed by the individual boards.
Right.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking in terms of those folks for whom the 3 boards acting jointly reserve an appointment privilege as opposed to delegating to the superintendent, which I think is still an open question, because I think there's a difference of opinion amongst boards and board members as to how far down the chain the superintendent's authority goes to make unilateral appointments. And so senior personnel is intended to capture that which the board has not delegated to the superintendent, which remains an open question.
Yeah, and I think there's a little bit of, so if we think of it as the contracted senior people, or we think of it as the direct reports to the superintendent, that's a different set of people.
Right. And I think that still remains a subject of the negotiating committee to make a recommendation to the 3 boards as to what that looks like, so that we can kind of put to bed the question of when the board has a role and what its role is with respect to anybody below the rank of superintendent.
Yep. Okay. So is there anything else on the mechanism that we think, I feel like we have a set of recommendations and sort of talking points to inform the conversation. Anything else here that we think we want to come up with some ideas on?
I just generally think that it remains a knotty issue. And I think that when we frame the conversation back to the boards to try to reach a consensus on this, that it is important to frame it as, I think everybody would feel better if there were a process that we could rely upon, rather than fighting about everybody's own independent memories of what's happened in the past.
Yeah.
And also recognize that this can be a living and evolving process.
Sure.
And if a year from now we say, this really didn't work in the context of whatever, it's encouraged to revise it to conform to a way that makes it work better. Because we're not going to solve for every contingency here.
But as we do that, we write it down.
Right. You default to this unless something else is written that clarifies it. And this encourages people to write those things that clarify it.
That's right. Yeah, good. We're going to hang it on the wall and say, this is what we're doing. And we're going to point to the thing that's on the wall until we say, this actually doesn't make sense to do it this way. And then we change the thing we're hanging on the wall.
Just like the long form, short form hiring process.
Yeah,
it's a place to start.
That's exactly right. Okay,
I
good.
just thought of one more thing.
Sure.
So at Region 9, our votes are not equal.
Mm-hmm. Right. We have that somewhere in here on the policy, the joint policy committees, whether or not that weighting carries over, which I think it's, our position that no, it doesn't. But
that just would have to be addressed someplace. I hadn't.
Yeah.
One more complicated thing that just popped into my head.
Within a supermajority, is it one person, one vote, or is it like?
Right. And I would say for the purposes of sort of those conversations, and I know that I'm the only Eastonite here right now, and it's about to shift to Easton in the next few years, right? Mm-hmm. So I think it's one person, one vote, and not weighted.
I think it would theoretically be weighted under option 4. like when the boards are voting independently of their own volition, Region 9's default voting rules would apply.
Right, and Region 9s would also apply in option 1. Right. Yep. So for option 2 and 3, I would say 75% of all members present and voting, and it's all members, and then I think we say sort of parenthetical, 1 member, 1 vote methodology. And I think we do the same thing here for the simple majority. I'm doing a parenthetical inside of a parenthetical. I'm so happy about that.
Extra points if you can get a semicolon in.
Okay. All right, good. So let's, I'm just going to check here. So meeting protocols, chair annual rotation. I think we have that already. Motion carried by all 3 boards. The degree to which this binds all 3 boards was a question. So all 3 boards vote. Can one board go back later, meet individually and say, we're going to unvote on this? And I think what we had talked about last time we met is this idea that, boards are able to do that, but that the process should be that they notify the other boards that they plan to do that and give the other boards an opportunity to attend. Whatever session they're having that would undo that. Yes, motion carried by all 3 boards, binds all 3 boards. Right. Okay. So that brings us back here, right? So then the question, if a board wishes to change course, a issue previously agreed upon, expectation by and this is a little bit loose, what that really means to attend as viewers, or as is this a tri-board meeting again?
Right. Yeah. And because if we're in this situation, there's going to be some animosity.
That's right.
So
That's right.
I think the temptation would be and honestly, it's not, I've been watching this for a long time. It's not always the Region 9 board it has been the Easton board that's been difficult sometimes. Just
yeah, I haven't seen the research, but the sort of anecdotal review of it, the sort of brief review that I heard Chris give recently, it sounded like the mechanism was used for Easton several times. Yeah. So it's, I think we all take our turn.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
so
yeah,
Chris, we had said we were going to come back to this after we sort of fleshed out the mechanism.
Yeah.
And sort of this idea that, how does one board undo their decision? So talking about the possibility of, I think, and we had floated this before, that, you got to notify the other boards. What, do you need to invite them into the conversation, or do you just need them to be notified that you're doing it?
So now, obviously, we're talking about things that sort of survive
right
the meeting.
Right.
So I think when it comes to, we no longer want to fund the director of fun and games.
Right.
I think you've got to say, we would like to reopen the central office budget. Mm-hmm. Is sort of the way you have to go about doing it.
Yeah.
And then you would have to get 2 out of the 3 boards to agree with you again. when it comes
So-
to issues,
That's interesting.
but there are some issues where I think you're just stuck, and that is things like we are going to fund a central office position, or once you commit to a certain structure jointly, I think
Yep.
it probably takes 2 out of 3 to unwind that.
Yeah, I mean, I have heard of the central office budget being reopened after budgets have failed,
Right.
but that has never been a contentious, as far as I know, has not been a contentious situation of one board wanting to reopen it and another. I think that's been agreed to, that it needs to be relooked at because the budgets are not passing.
But I could see a circumstance where, let's say, in the current year, Reading is going to see probably a flat to negative tax situation, and Easton is not because of the enrollment shift. And it's conceivable that the Reading budget will pass, the Region 9 budget will pass on the back of Reading voters, and the Easton budget will fail. And the Easton board will say, we need to find another X dollars. We'd like to reopen the central office budget to squeeze another $30,000 out from our share, because maybe we shouldn't do this, that, or the other thing.
Sure.
And then the Easton board would have to come to the other two boards and say, we'd like to reopen the budget. And the Region 9 board and the Reading board could say, but we really, really value this investment. We don't want to undo that investment.
Right.
And we could say no. And then Easton would have to find that $30,000 somewhere else. I think would be
one of your members would be vocally contacting us in the meantime.
Well, I'm just sort of playing forward the hypothetical, obviously.
Yeah, I think you have. Yeah, no, I think it's a really interesting scenario. I think what we're saying is, however you come to agreement, you know, whether it's through some variation on the mechanism or through regular, all three boards agree. To unagree, it's the same thing.
Right.
To unagree requires a vote of the three boards. So on issues that involve the three boards, getting in and coming out, you need the three boards.
And so then that if we accept that as true,
yeah,
it begs a subsidiary question, which is, who has the authority to call a tri-board meeting?
Right.
And B, if, let's say, the Easton board wanted to reopen the central office budget to remove, $100,000 in staples, could they, in their individual meetings, say, the Easton board moves to reopen the central office budget and remove $100,000, and then basically send a memorandum to the other two boards, and then they can vote seated individually on the same issue, and the result of those three meetings is the outcome? Or do they have to be seated jointly to have that conversation and to vote jointly? Like, what can be handled by three boards sitting separately, and what has to be handled by three boards sitting jointly? And
well,
that is,
yeah.
Is
and
it,
that relates to the question of, if Easton wants to reopen the central office budget, but if Reading is chairing the tri-board and I say, no, I don't want to hold a tri-board meeting, does that end the issue? Or does any one board chair in a circumstance like that have the authority to say, I'd like to have all three boards meet?
Yeah. I mean, I would think at a minimum, 2 out of 3 board chairs can call a tri-board meeting.
Mm-hmm.
but
and-
since there's no such thing as a tri-board meeting.
Right.
That's a-
Any difference between 3 boards meeting at the same time in the same room and 3 boards meeting 3 nights in a row in 3 different locations?
Yeah.
Is it the same thing?
And that's where you get into what is legally technically effective and what is sort of agreed to process and sort of MOU kind of language of, we agree not to do things independently in these areas because we think it is in the overall value of the interests of why we cooperate to do them in the same room at the same time.
So what are the things that we agree?
It's a short list. I think it starts easily with the central office budget. I don't think any of the three boards should be independently debating the central office budget outside of should we ask to reopen it.
Okay.
The next issue would be contracts that are agreed to jointly between the three boards. That would be food service, transportation. There are certainly others that are of a lower dollar value that typically don't rise to board level discussion. So,
Do we have a contract with Shipman and Goodwin?
not trilaterally,
Huh. Okay.
because and that's where you get into fun little conflicts of interest of when Shipman is advising the Easton Board of Education, they can't tell me what they talk to you about.
Right.
Then they can bill us twice.
Making a lot of arguments for regionalization here by accident.
Yeah. That's funny.
Although you can never pass up a lawyer joke opportunity.
So we have central office budget contracts, senior administrative, blah, blah,
Well, I
blah.
don't even know about that because, like, take Dr. Harrison's evaluation.
Right.
That is traditionally and probably appropriately handled on a board level basis because he's employed theoretically as the head of each of the three school districts.
Could we say hiring of senior staff?
Yes.
Wouldn't it be hiring, evaluation, termination, all that
Well,
stuff?
but I think we're saying the evaluation. So it's hiring and firing, but not evaluation.
Okay.
Evaluation happens separately.
So those are set.
Or maybe shouldn't. I mean, that becomes a question of discussion.
I'm not taking a position.
Yeah.
It was a category.
Yeah, that's good.
We're just creating an issues list that's longer than the agreed to procedures.
Okay.
The formation and dissolution of joint committees. And I would assume sub to that would be action taken upon the recommendations of those committees. Although I'm not even sure about that because if the Joint Transportation Committee recommends the adoption of an amendment to a transportation contract, we have quite regularly adopted those individually because it
Right.
hasn't required a joint conversation.
Right.
It's pro forma.
Easton passed the Title IX policy work that we did
Right.
a month ago. Yeah.
So I want to be careful about
Yep.
because we don't want to be in a situation where we're compelled to call more tri-board meetings than we need to,
Right.
as fun as they are.
Anything else? I mean, could it be said that it's the formation, dissolution, and there is a sort of ongoing, like the work of the joint committees is a joint responsibility? For example, if let's say that one of the board's members were not showing up to joint committees and making it so that we didn't have quorum, it is a joint responsibility that we're getting our members to show up at these joint meetings.
I'm trying to figure out how to articulate that. Because I mean, you're right. In theory, if we created a committee that that one of the boards sort of objected to in principle,
Mhm.
they could submarine the whole thing by their appointee never showing up.
Correct.
basically.
Correct.
Although, if you're always having at least, the only way that's a problem now is
Correct.
with a disequal allocation of seats on these committees.
Correct. Which we I think is on our to-do list to discuss.
Mhm.
Yeah. Formation and dissolution of joint committees. It's like the carrying on of regular business. How do you say that?
Keep on keeping on.
You keep on keeping on. Got it.
Because I don't think you want to list as a responsibility the receiving of reports that are of joint interest to the boards, because that's
Right.
meaningless.
Yeah. Okay. Is this our list then? Do we have anything else that we think of as sort of joint responsibilities?
I don't think so, because other things, I don't want to talk about things that we could still do seated individually
Right.
to carry out the purpose of joint cooperation.
Right. We said contracts, food service, transportation. We said hiring, termination. What about contracts and compensation conversations for senior staff?
That should probably be in that list.
I think that, yeah.
Man. It's been a week. Okay.
It's been a year, John, a year.
Yeah. Okay. Multi-board meeting governance. Okay, so we have, let's just take it. So the annual rotation of the chair, did we put that in here? Did we?
Yep, it's right below where we just were.
Okay. All right, good. So motions carried by all three boards. So that is here and here. So this guy, and then this turns into the mechanism conversation. Motion carried by all three boards. So where do we land on this? You know, what are the options that we would want to present and discuss?
Yeah, I think this almost begets a flowchart of,
I agree.
you know, here's how a decision is made, here's how a decision is unmade.
Yep.
And the various options that are born from that. And I think the simplicity of you unwind something the same way you wind something is helpful. Because what you don't want is to say that, you know, Easton and Region 9 compelled Reading to do something, and then Reading can unwind it by just the next day saying, we're not going to do this.
Yeah.
It defeats the purpose.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Although again, that is in sort of MOA territory, because legally any board can say we're not going to participate, right? I mean, this is all going to, I don't know. I'm just.
Yeah, I agree, Gwen. It's really, it's hairy.
Right, because let's play forward the hypothetical of Easton's budget fails and they say, I need to find $250,000. And they say, instead of contributing $640,000 to central office, we're going to contribute $400,000 to central office, deal with it.
Right.
Then the Reading and Region 9 boards of education are suing you for $249,000.
Right.
And, you know, to what end?
Right.
So there's a certain level of, I don't want to say faith, but
yeah, I agree with that. But I think Gwen's right. It's MOA territory, because yes, we would be within our rights to blow ourselves up like that.
Yes, I'm not advocating for
right. Yeah, that's right. I think we could take this really ill-conceived, idea and run right into the wall with it. But
you give yourself some protection, though, if you say that we are creating this structure, and then each of the three boards adopts policy 9542 or whatever it is in their bylaws that would say, put some structure around this and say that we're allocating, when the board agrees to contribute to, the central office allocation at a third,
right,
it commits to doing that absent a vote of whatever, so then that board becomes bound by its own policy.
Yeah.
And then would have to take an affirmative vote to suspend its own policy, and then an affirmative vote to break that. And you're just creating additional hurdles and political pressure to not do that.
Yeah, I agree. And you're also able to point to the wall in the conversation where some members are saying, I don't care if it blows us up, this is what we should do. You can at least point to the wall and say, remember, this is what we agreed to. This is the process that we said made the most sense and was the most reasonable way of working together. So I think there's like levels, right? The first level is we talked about this process. We agreed this is what we thought sounded reasonable so that we could work together in a constructive manner. The next level that, really locks it in even better is to enshrine it in the bylaws. So individual policies on each board that enshrine these, and that would require, sort of specific procedural votes to override in the context of that process.
I mean, you could even carve out in the bylaws that you require a unanimous vote on the board to suspend this particular bylaw, and then you've created an enormous protection that also, frankly, any one board, particularly the Easton and Reading boards, could turn around to their financing authority in a situation where there is hypothetical pressure to say, well, can't you just take it at a central office? Like, no, because I need 7 out of 7 or 6 out of 6 and I don't have it.
Right. Yeah. Okay, good. All right. So just looking at the list. Oh, noticing the time. Okay. Sorry. And Stephanie, I think there was something, and I think what we had talked about before you joined was the idea that maybe you tee it up now and then we make that, like we focus more on the topic next week. So do you unless there's additional discussion on this item, I think we can move to administrative updates. And Stephanie, you had something you wanted us to start thinking about?
Yep. So I recommend that the policy committee in a future meeting discuss the updated legislation with respect to school climate policy. Specifically, there is a new definition for bullying, which we should discuss, as well as a number of other changes. So that policy needs to be updated this year.
Okay. Good. All right.
I think looking at the calendar, we have a meeting next Friday, the 26th.
Mm-hmm.
I believe we do not meet on the 2nd, which is Good Friday.
That's right.
And so next week, the 26th, is our only remaining meeting before the evening meeting on April 8th.
Mm-hmm.
So hopefully Maureen will be able to attend and we can sort of bottom out on the tri-board stuff and have a recommendation or at least a plan going forward for the 8th by the close of our discussion on Friday.
Yep. Good.
And then any balance of time, I think it makes sense to look at this bullying issue, particularly if we want to get it approved in this academic year as time flies.
Agreed. I agree for the, I think the thought you had, Chris, about a flow chart. I think graphics and visuals will help significantly in framing the conversation in April. And I think I think what also helps us is remembering that this is a meeting of the policy committee. This is not a tri-board meeting. We're inviting everybody in and we want to hear their voices. We want them to be a part of this conversation, but ultimately we are not here deciding anything except what our recommendation will be back to the boards.
This is feedback on what people think in an environment where they can collaboratively give input to the committee, which can then take it back, form something that looks like a policy and bring it back to the May meeting.
Right. Okay. Good. Okay. Any other discussion? Any committee member comment? No. No members of the public are present, so no committee member comment. Look for a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
You have a second? Thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
Very good. We are unanimously adjourned at